Dan Moretti, the son of a mafia boss, moved to a new school in hopes of living a normal life. However, he quickly became the target of a group of arrogant bullies, led by Ryan Carter. Despite being publicly humiliated and filmed in mocking videos, Dan did not respond with violence. He chose silence and strategy. But when things went too far, Dan silently. The hallway of the high school suddenly fell silent, leaving only the sound of hurried footsteps as students rushed to and fro. But then, the stillness was torn apart by a loud, mocking laugh. A group of students had surrounded a teenager, whose head was being shoved into a locker like a lifeless animal. The boy, a new student, had no friends, no one to stand up for him. His face reddened in embarrassment, but his hands clenched tightly, and his lips were sealed, making no sound. The group outside laughed loudly, satisfied as if they had achieved something immensely glorious. They turned back, staring at their phone. Of course, a humiliating scene had been recorded and was ready to spread on social media. None of the group showed any compassion. No one had any intention of helping. All eyes were indifferent, some even mocking further. Suddenly, one person in the group spoke up. "Is he deaf? Can't he react?" But then, amidst all the laughter and gleeful glances, a shadow appeared. A teenager stood silently in the corner of the hallway, not paying attention to the disdainful looks from the bullies. His eyes were cold, unwavering, with no sign of movement. His shoulders were solid as a rock. No one could see the pain in his eyes, only the terrifying stillness. He did not react, not a word. He stood there, as if the world around him were nothing more than invisible shadows. Even as the students continued to mock him, it seemed like he could no longer hear them. Nothing could shake him. His gaze, it was like a cold warning. Dan Moretti, 17 years old, stood firm in the classroom with his tall frame and quiet eyes. Eyes that few could look into directly without feeling a cold, profound chill. His face showed no emotion. It was like a cold stone wall, not allowing anyone to see through. Dan's black hair was slightly long, falling over his forehead, but it didn't soften the stern look emanating from him. Though only 17 years old, the way he stood, the way he looked, and the silence around him made everyone feel that he was no ordinary teenager. He was the son of Matteo Moretti, a powerful mafia boss who could make the whole city tremble with a mere gesture. Matteo was a man of few words, living by strict principles and believing only in one thing: power. Not the kind of power that comes with noise, violence, or threats. No, he always told his son, real power is making others know they're wrong without saying a word. Matteo taught Dan that to be truly strong, sometimes you don't need to act, you don't need to speak. Silence itself is what makes others afraid. It is an invisible power that makes the person opposite reflect on their actions. What can you do with silence, Dan? Matteo once asked his son as they sat together in the cold mansion. Silence will scare them more than any threat. However, what Dan desired was the complete opposite. He didn't want to carry the massive shadow of his family. He didn't want to be recognized just because of his name. Every time someone heard the name Moretti, they only thought of power, cruelty, and the darkness that this family had left in the heart of the city. Dan longed for a normal life, where he was not the son of the mafia boss, where he could freely choose his life without being bound by the name Moretti. Since he was young, he had learned to keep silent, to control his emotions, and not let anyone know what was going on in his mind. But as he grew older, Dan increasingly felt that this silence was not a voluntary choice. It was a burden he had to carry, a responsibility he could not escape, whether he wanted it or not. Matteo, the tough father who rarely shows emotion, always reminded his son, "You must understand that honor is the most important thing. Never let anyone take your honor away. If you must act, remember, there is no turning back." His father's words always stayed with Dan, but deep down, he longed for the day when he could throw away everything his father had taught him, to live like other people his age and just be himself, not the son of a mafia boss. But with a name like Moretti, could a normal life really come so easily? On the first day Dan walked into the new school, everything initially seemed as calm as the first day for any student. Other students were walking through the halls, laughing and chatting, but there were also curious eyes following him. Dan walked through the school gate with a calm demeanor, the appearance of someone not easily moved, and he knew this would make those eyes impossible to ignore. He didn't care about those looks, because for Dan, everything was just beginning. But then, everything changed when he met Ryan Carter, a senior, known for his large frame and loud personality. Ryan loved to show off in front of crowds, to grab attention with malicious pranks, and surely, he couldn't pass up a new target like Dan. As soon as his eyes fell on Dan, Ryan realized something that intrigued him. Dan was fresh meat, a perfect target for his bullying games. As soon as Dan walked into the cafeteria, before he could react, Ryan rushed over, shoved him hard, making Dan almost fall. A plate of food in Ryan's hand flew out, splattering on Dan. Laughter erupted from Ryan's friends, eyes full of satisfaction, enthusiastic clapping. "Deaf mute, what are you doing?" "Huh," Ryan shouted, continuing to mock. He knew that just one taunt was enough to make Dan the laughingstock of everyone. But strangely, Dan didn't react. He didn't lash out, didn't say a word. He just stood there, his cold eyes unmoving. The feeling of anger and hatred from the crowd passed over him like a breeze, but Dan remained silent, still, and unaffected. This made Ryan even angrier. He couldn't understand why Dan wasn't reacting like everyone else. He didn't fight back, didn't shout, didn't resist at all. In Ryan's eyes, this wasn't a victory. He couldn't control Dan like he had with so many others, and this made him feel humiliated. Day after day, Ryan continued his taunts and bullying, but Dan remained resolutely silent. The more silent Dan was, the more Ryan felt his anger grow, unable to calm down. He decided to escalate things to try and challenge Dan, but all his efforts ended in failure. Dan remained still, as if nothing could shake his composure. Until one day, when Dan saw an Asian student, a small boy, being bullied by Ryan's group. They shoved him, mocked him, and humiliated the boy right in front of everyone. The boy didn't dare fight back, his eyes filled with panic and pain. Dan stood watching, unable to do anything. A sudden feeling of shame surged within him. He asked himself, "What am I doing here? Why am I standing by?" He remembered what his father had once taught him. If you cannot protect the vulnerable, then you're not worthy of being the son of the Moretti family. It was a lesson Dan always carried with him, but now he felt ashamed of his own silence. The images of the Asian boy, the cruel words from Ryan, all of it made Dan unable to stay silent any longer. But strangely, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel the need for revenge with violence, not with punches or insults. He knew he could do something else, something more effective. A strategy of silence. He could no longer stand by while the weak were being tormented. Dan decided that it was time to fight back, but not with the actions of a weak person. He would use his intelligence and strategy to make Ryan and the others realize that silence could be the most powerful weapon. And so, Dan's strategy of silence began. He didn't rush to act. He just needed to let time and his actions prove that sometimes, silence is more terrifying than anything else. After a long day, Dan returned home, his heart heavy with thoughts. Each step along the quiet path made him feel the emptiness inside. He went straight into the room, sitting down in the large living room chair, where the dim light from the yellow lamp illuminated the old walls, marked by time. Mateo, his father, sat opposite him, the large table between them creating a clear boundary. Although his father was a man of few words, whenever he spoke, the silence in the room seemed to thicken, as though his words carried an invisible weight. Dan felt his father's gaze piercing through him, without a word of reproach, but his silence made everything feel more tense than ever. "What did you do when you were bullied?" Mateo asked, his voice calm, yet challenging. Dan looked up, unable to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. He had thought about this all day, reflecting on his actions. But he still didn't have an answer. He could only look at his father, silent. Silence is not always the answer, Dan. True power is the ability to restrain. But restraint doesn't mean doing nothing. Mateo continued, his gaze stern, not a hint of softness. You must remember, power isn't violence, but the ability to make others realize they are wrong without saying a word. But once you act, there's no turning back. His father's words echoed in Dan's head like an incantation that could never be erased. Dan felt every word from Mateo cut into his heart like sharp knives. He had grown up with these principles, learning not to let emotions govern his actions. But now, everything had become harder than ever. How could he remain silent when the weak around him were being abused and mocked? He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't continue to live under his father's shadow. Dan looked straight into his father's eyes. For the first time in this conversation, his gaze did not falter. He saw in Mateo's eyes a deep sadness, a loneliness that he had always concealed beneath the mask of a tough man. He wondered, if I do nothing, who will protect me? Who will protect those weaker than me? Dan's eyes began to burn with determination. He didn't want to walk the path of his father, the path that he knew would offer no turning back. But deep inside, he couldn't just remain still when the values he believed in were being trampled upon. He needed to find another way to preserve his honor, without sacrificing his identity, without using violence to reclaim power. Dad, I understand, Dan spoke, but couldn't hide the confusion in his voice. I don't want to do what you do. But I can't stay silent when everything around me is happening like this. I need to do something. Not for myself, but for those weaker than me. Mateo looked at Dan in silence. He didn't say anything more, only gazing at his son with a penetrating look. Dan knew that, no matter what advice his father gave, the final decision was his own. And Dan understood that the path he chose would never be easy. Walking out of the room, Dan felt heavy, but he also felt clarity in his heart. He would not follow his father's path, but he could not abandon those who needed protection. He had to find a way to protect his honor without losing his own worth. Silence could still be a powerful weapon, but it wasn't always enough. He would figure out a way to make people realize that true power wasn't just in violent actions, but in restraint and intelligence. On a Tuesday morning, before the sunlight had warmed the chilly autumn air, Dan walked into the school cafeteria with a calm demeanor, not the slightest bit flustered. He was used to living in silence, but today, something different awaited him. Ryan stood nearby, his eyes lighting up when he saw Dan walk by. He covertly held his phone in his hand, seizing the opportunity he thought was too good to miss. With a mischievous grin, Ryan waited for the perfect moment. Just as Dan neared his table, Ryan suddenly stood up and shoved him hard. The plate of food in his hand flew out, spilling all over Dan. Fries, tomatoes, and sauce splattered, creating a large stain on Dan's shirt. Laughter erupted throughout the cafeteria. Mocking glances and satisfied looks swept over Dan, and in that moment, he felt like nothing more than a joke. But what made everything worse wasn't just the shove, but how quickly Ryan grabbed his phone and started recording a short video. He stood there, laughing derisively as he filmed Dan, covered in food, and hit the upload button to social media instantly. This is what Dan Moretti calls silence? Is he deaf or just voluntarily playing the fool? Ryan wrote in the caption, attaching the video. Within seconds, the video was widely shared, spreading throughout the school like wildfire. The laughter still echoed, but this time, it came from the crowd gathered around their phones, eyes glued to the screen. Dan was the star of this mocking story, and everyone in the school knew about him. Not for his talents or his distinctiveness, but for that video, the video that publicly humiliated him. It felt like a nightmare. Mocking glances fell on Dan as he stood silently in the cafeteria, as if the whole world was laughing at him. He could feel their gazes, eyes that lacked sympathy, filled only with contempt and enjoyment at another's pain. But strangely, Dan didn't react. He didn't rush to delete the clip. He didn't try to retaliate or shout back. He just stood there, staring at the phone, watching the video that Ryan had posted, and then he smiled, a very slight, very faint smile, but one full of resilience. He didn't need to prove anything. He knew that Ryan and the others mocking him didn't understand what they had done. Unlike the others, Dan didn't try to erase the shame. He did nothing but let the clip exist. A simple video with no words, but it was the living proof, the black and white evidence that showed what kind of person Ryan really was. He knew that, no matter how far the video spread, what Ryan tried to do would never last. The laughter of the crowd wouldn't last forever, and Dan, he would stand strong, silent, and one day, make Ryan regret his actions. That video wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Dan wouldn't seek revenge immediately, but he knew one thing for sure. In that silence, Dan would do things Ryan couldn't anticipate. He wouldn't let this humiliation consume his life. But what he didn't expect to happen did. One afternoon, as the weak sunlight filtered through the yellowed leaves on the trees, Dan sat in his living room, staring out the window. The feeling of loneliness crept up again, even though people were still around. He still couldn't shake the suffocating feeling that he was always being watched and couldn't do anything without attracting attention. He knew that, with just one small mistake, everything could fall apart. Suddenly, the living room door opened, and a man walked in, with a strong and calm presence. It was Dan's cousin, Luca. Luca was part of the Moretti family, and like others in the family, he was not lacking in strength or power. However, what made Luca different was his sharpness in how he perceived things. He never rushed to make decisions, but always observed and thought things through carefully. "Little brother, it seems like you're having some trouble lately," Luca said, his voice deep and cold, as if he already understood everything Dan was going through. He stared directly into Dan's eyes, his gaze sharp, as if he could see through all of Dan's thoughts. Dan stayed silent, not responding immediately. He was sure his cousin wouldn't visit unless there was a reason. Luca must have heard about the video from Ryan and felt the need to intervene. Luca walked to the chair opposite him and sat down, continuing, "You could end all of this right now. If you want Ryan to disappear, just make a phone call. The family has enough power to do that, and you know it." Luca spoke as if it were a simple choice, nothing complicated. Just one decision, one phone call, and it would all be over. Dan sensed the temptation in Luca's words, but he was not swayed. He had heard these words since he was a child, had seen his father and the others in the family do this effortlessly, without hesitation. They could take everything away, crush any opponent. But that wasn't what Dan wanted. He wanted to stand on his own, to decide his life without living in the shadow of the family. Dan turned to look at Luca, his gaze firm. "If I do that, I'll just be another Ryan." His response was not rushed but quiet and profound. He was not the kind of person who would lose himself to easy choices. Luca stared at him for a moment, his expression not surprised, as though he had expected this answer. However, there was something in Luca's gaze as he heard Dan's reply, a respect, an acknowledgement that Dan had chosen a different path for himself. "You're not Ryan, Dan," Luca said, his voice softer now, but still full of seriousness. "I understand. But don't forget, in this family, we have power, and sometimes power is the only thing that can help protect yourself and those around you." Dan nodded, but the determination within him did not waver. He did not contradict Luca, but inside, he knew that restraint and intellect would be his path. He didn't want to become someone like Ryan, someone who only knew how to control and dominate others with strength. He wanted to prove that silence, restraint, and intellect were the most powerful weapons. Luca didn't say anything more. He stood up, lightly patted Dan on the shoulder, and walked toward the door. "You're the one who knows how to choose. I respect your decision," he said before leaving a quiet stillness in the living room. Dan sat alone, feeling as though he had just faced a monumental decision. He didn't need to become part of the darkness of the Moretti family. He would walk his own path, a path without violence, without control through fists or power. He would restrain himself, win with intellect, not strength. And this, Dan knew, would be a greater challenge than any battle he had ever faced. One day, as Dan was walking down the hallway at school, he began to sense a shift in the air. Everything seemed normal, with the students around him talking and laughing, but there was a heavy feeling, not easily noticeable, but clearly there was surveillance happening. Dan glanced around and caught Ryan's gaze. That look was no longer full of disdain or mockery like before, but one full of anger, hatred. A few days later, Dan realized that Ryan was no longer just a simple bully. He had started to follow him, secretly tracking Dan's every move, waiting for an opportunity to retaliate. But instead of confronting Dan directly, Ryan had hired a group of other students to watch Dan, looking for ways to make him pay for his silence. Dan was not surprised. He knew that Ryan wasn't the type of person to let this go easily, but he wasn't scared either. He lived with controlling his emotions and never allowed himself to fall into a situation where an enemy could easily control him. But inside, he felt a coldness rising. He knew that once Ryan had decided to go down this path, he wouldn't give up easily. One afternoon, as Dan walked out of the classroom, Ryan was already standing at the end of the hallway, alone, as if waiting for an opportunity. He didn't say a word, just stared at Dan with a look of hatred. Dan didn't feel worried. He simply looked straight into Ryan's eyes, his expression calm, unchanged. Ryan started to walk toward him, his steps quick, as though wanting to challenge him. He no longer had the same confidence, only a blind rage. "Who do you think you are?" Ryan sneered. "Silence isn't the way to deal with this, Moretti." Dan stood still, not backing down, his gaze still sharp, but without a trace of anger. He was used to the taunts, the mockery, but this time it would be different. He didn't need to shout or act violently. Just one sentence, a single sentence for Ryan to understand that Dan was not someone he could easily ridicule. "I've kept quiet because I choose kindness," Dan said, his voice cold but unwavering. "But if you continue, I'm not sure what will happen next." The words hit like a bomb in the quiet of the hallway. Ryan fell silent, an indescribable feeling running through his body. The confidence he always had suddenly vanished, replaced by a vague fear that he couldn't explain. Dan didn't need to move, didn't need to lift a finger. Just one soft sentence, but it was a warning he couldn't deny. Ryan swallowed hard but couldn't say anything more. He looked at Dan again, his eyes now filled with panic, as if questioning whether Dan could really do something. But Dan's gaze didn't change. It was still cold and sharp as a blade, making Ryan feel small and weak. Without another word, Dan turned and walked away. He didn't need to wait for Ryan's response, didn't need to prove anything. Dan knew that Ryan wouldn't dare do anything more. Just that look, just that one sentence, Dan had left Ryan with a cold chill that he wouldn't forget. Ryan stood there, saying nothing, just watching Dan's figure disappear down the hallway. He felt an unexplained fear, a sensation he had never experienced before. And in that moment, Ryan realized something. Dan Moretti was not someone who could be easily subdued, and he would never be able to control him. After that incident, everything at school changed, but not in the way Ryan had expected. In the days that followed, he no longer dared to bully anyone. Every time he walked through the halls, he would lower his head, avoiding the gazes of others. A strange and heavy feeling weighed on him. He no longer dared to act brashly, no longer had the confident air he always displayed before. The friends he once had, the ones who had once cheered for his cruel jokes, gradually distanced themselves from him. They didn't say anything, but the way they passed by without greeting, without the friendly shoulder pats they had given him before, made Ryan feel like an outcast, abandoned. Ryan's presence in the school grew fainter. He was no longer the name mentioned in jokes, no longer the center of attention. Instead, he became a shadow, moving through each day unnoticed. The mocking laughter that used to ring out when he entered a room was gone, replaced by silence. He could clearly feel that everyone had turned their backs on him, and that was the price he had to pay for his cruel pranks and arrogance for too long. As for Dan, he continued living as usual. He didn't boast about what had happened, didn't explain or show off to anyone. He went through each day in silence, but that silence carried great power. The questions from friends, the curious stares from other students, he would respond with a gentle smile and a shake of his head. He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to say anything because everyone understood. What needed to be said had been said. He had let his actions speak for themselves, and didn't need to prove anything. His silence had done it all. Each step he took through the school, with no words, no criticism, but everyone who had once looked down on him, everyone who had thought they could defeat him, now remained silent, not daring to say anything. He, not with power, not with violence, but with his own restraint, had made everyone lower their heads. Do you think Dan should have stood up from the start, or stayed silent as he did? Have you ever witnessed silence that made you change your perception of someone? If you believe silence can be the most powerful weapon, like this video, comment and share the times you've seen the underdog teach the strong a lesson. And don't forget to subscribe to Proud Stories to not miss the plot twists that make people rethink the world around them.